Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm joined with very special guest, UFC play-by-play commentator, press conference host, and overall company man for the UFC. How are you, Jon Anik?
I'm good, my man. It's good to be with you, Jay. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I appreciate your time. Obviously, you came off UFC 290 and International Fight Week in Las Vegas, Nevada. What's that experience like?
So sometimes I'm accused of having a recency bias when I suggest that a live event is the greatest that I've ever witnessed, or if a fighter is potentially the greatest of all time. Certainly, we've had some special UFC live events. UFC 217 is immortalized there behind me. But I think UFC 290 was just the perfect storm. International Fight Week. For me, that Hall of Fame induction ceremony is something that's near and dear to my heart. So that sort of elevates the entire week. And what a climax UFC 290 was, right? You almost forget about the main event because the live event up to that point in time was so good. And I think you need moments, singular moments, right? And I thought, with respect to Alexandre Pantoja and everybody else, that the biggest moment of the night was Dricus du Plessis stopping Robert Whitaker inside of 10 minutes, which he told the world he was going to do. You had Bo Nickel come out and do what he did with his hands. So I don't know, man. Recency bias may be a part of it, but that is as special a live event as I've covered, certainly in the last 5 years.
From just a fan's perspective, for me, it might be card of the year. Like you said, the Duplessis stoppage, no one saw that. Bo Nickel getting a knockout on his feet. Robbie Lawler retiring with a win, too.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It was an embarrassment of riches. I forgot the Robbie Lawler moment, and maybe that's because it wasn't a part of the pay-per-view, but that was arguably the biggest moment of the night. And even like Jesus Aguilar with a huge 17-second knockout early on doesn't get a bonus, despite the fact that his opponent is completely unconscious, with toes pointed in the air. So it was a special night, and Salt Lake City looks pretty good on paper. We'll see what kind of encore we can provide here in about 10 days.
What's it like being involved in a card of that magnitude? Do you get any nerves before you go on air?
I would say it's adrenaline more than nerves at this point in time. Certainly for our UFC live events, I would say when I do the Hall of Fame induction ceremony and I walk out and I'm staring down the barrel of 1 or 2 thousand people in a very tight, stuffy environment, maybe I feel some nerves in that Hall of Fame setting. But when I'm ready to call a UFC live event, I think at that point in time, it's just adrenaline. I think there's so much anxiety, and you might have heard me say this before, but there's so much anxiety that comes with the preparation that once I get to fight night, it's almost like you and me talking, right? I'm staring down the barrel of a camera, and yeah, there's maybe 2 million people on the other side, but I don't necessarily feel it or see it as such. So nerves, not necessarily, but adrenaline's a powerful thing, and hopefully we can channel it in the right way.
With your relationship with Joe Rogan and DC on commentary, do you think that helps calm the nerves?
Oh, for sure. So the first time I worked with Joe was actually, a lot of people don't know this, UFC 155 in 2012. I don't even want to know how old or young you were back in 2012 when I called my first pay-per-view.
I would have been like
But,
9 years old.
right. So oftentimes I find myself being the oldest man in the room nowadays. But I got that call about a year into my now 13-year run with the UFC. And it was like 3 or 4 days notice. I got the call on Christmas Day that I was getting called up to the big leagues 4 days later on December 29, 2012. So yeah, back then I was freaking out. And even then, no Spotify deal, but Joe Rogan was still larger than life. He was still one of the probably biggest male influencers in the entire United States of America back in 2012. So getting the call to work with him was obviously very special, but now I consider him a friend. And yeah, that helps. It always feels bigger and of a higher magnitude when Rogan is there. And yeah, I mean, DC, right? He went from being a guy who I admired from afar to being one of my dearest friends in the world. And he definitely has a calming influence over me. I remember even the first time we called a pay-per-view together, he and I, in 2017. And I was nervous for that one, UFC 208 in Brooklyn, New York. And he was like, dude, you were meant to do this. You'll be fine. And I'll never forget him sort of talking me off the ledge at that point in time. I have a pretty good kinship with all my broadcast partners and teams. Sometimes I wish I would have 1 or 2 teams and not 15 teams that are always revolving. But it's a dream job, man, as I think you know.
Well, when you're talking about DC, I remember when he won the belt against Stipe Miocic, one of the iconic pictures, you with your hands up, him with his hands up. You saying history for DC. What is it like when you see one of your colleagues in the booth go on to be a double champion?
There's nothing quite like it. And DC and I, obviously now 5 years removed from that, are much closer than we were even then. But it's easy for me once the fight begins to put that relationship aside and check the emotions. But certainly when DC hits that tunnel and his walkout song hits, or somebody like Dominic Cruz, it's a difficult thing. And I'm sure a lot of people who have friends in the business or relatives in the business who are fighters can absolutely relate to a lot of the emotions that I feel. But I have a job to do. And once that fight starts, I think if anything, subconsciously, I'm more inclined to give credit to Stipe Miocic or Casey Kenny or the guy who's fighting my broadcast partner, if anything, as opposed to giving undue credit to my broadcast partner. But it's been a thrill. It's certainly nice when they win because it gives you sort of an added jolt through the rest of the night. Certainly when they lose, like when Dom lost to Henry Cejudo, it's sort of, can give you a downtrodden turn into the rest of the pay-per-view. So it's a weird thing, right? Like a lot of NFL announcers certainly can't relate to calling sporting events involving their broadcast partners, never mind an actual fist fight. But that's the space in which we live, my man, as you know all too well.
Well, when Dom Cruz fought Henry Cejudo, that was during the pandemic at the UFC Apex. What was that experience like, going from an sold-out arenas to an empty Apex?
Crazy, man. It's crazy to think back upon that time in all of our lives, and to think back to, at least here in the United States of America, the domestic footprint that we were able to establish because we were the only show in town during COVID-19. It can't be overstated, right? We've always been pretty big internationally. I mean, I would argue we're the biggest sport in Australia. In the United Kingdom, we're absolutely enormous. Brazil. But in the United States of America, right, there's always been this mainstream four. That's football, basketball, baseball, hockey. And MMA has constantly been trying to sort of knock on, if not knock down, that door. And the global pandemic really helped. But as a broadcaster, it's just absolutely insane, Jay, to think back to those shows that we did with no fans. It had a profound impact on even the athletes, right? Dominic Cruz is fond of saying, if I have a bad warm-up, all I need is a crowd to maybe get me back where I need to be and get those juices flowing. But during a COVID-19 situation, you have a bad warm up and then, you're walking out and it's like, let's go, Dom. You hear one fan, there's nothing. So I did not at all like calling fights at the Apex during that time. I love that we were the only show in town, but I think you and I can both agree it's absolutely crazy and sad that DC and Stipe completed their trilogy at the damn UFC Apex with no fans, right? So title fights for me can't happen at the UFC Apex. I think we have to stop at everything to try to avoid that fate. And as you see with Valentina Shevchenko and Alexa Grasso, September 16th, that's going to be at T-Mobile Arena where it belongs.
Well, another fight that should have been a sold-out arena was Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou, the hardest hitter versus one of the best heavyweights of all time.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it was what it was. And I give the UFC a lot of credit for doing what it had to do to get back into a state of normalcy in terms of putting on live events. It's always a little bit eerie for us when we go back to Abu Dhabi because it still feels a little bit like Fight Island, even though we're not bubbled off from the rest of the world. But I think we'll look back upon that time in all of our lives and careers, for better or for worse. But I think for us, we learned a lot in terms of navigating that. And it was weird, man. Like I'd show up to the UFC Apex and everybody had to be in a mask except for the announcers, right? It was weird. It was a really, really weird time in our lives and challenging. And we definitely got through it as a staff.
Well, going from empty arenas at the Apex to the first UFC live event with fans in there, Jacksonville, Jorge Masvidal versus Kamaru Usman, did that feel like an extra excitement around the arena?
Dude, that felt like I was on some serious recreational drugs. I mean, that was insane. And you're wise to bring it up. I will never forget that live event and what that week held just as a whole. It was crazy, man. Like, for lack of a better adjective, just seeing the world come together again and to see how fired up the Floridians were to be a part of that live event and to see how many people traveled from out of state to be a part of that live event. No seat was empty for the first prelim of the night. Liang Na and Ariane Carne-Losi, right? They were cheering as if it was a goddamn title fight. So for all of the loss of life and for all of the illness and for all of the challenges, there was some good to come out of that situation. And UFC 261, certainly one of the more memorable live events for me, for DC, for Joe Rogan that we've ever called.
I want to take you back to the start of your commentary career in 2007 when you were commentating on regional MMA shows and boxing fights in the Philippines. Did you think 16 years on you'd be lead play-by-play for one of the biggest organizations in the world?
Certainly not. So when I was at ESPN, it was hard to get regular play-by-play repetitions. I would get a college football game, but maybe I'd only get one a season. I would get some boxing on ESPN3.com, but they would essentially say, go to boxrec.com and try to figure out who these guys are, because nobody really knew who they were. It allowed me to cut my teeth, and first and foremost, I think it allowed me to realize and crystallize what I wanted to do, which was live events and play-by-play. I didn't want to necessarily be in a studio, be in a highlight machine, doing football or baseball highlights all night. I wanted to be doing live events. And I felt like my skill set sort of lent itself to that medium and that particular arm of broadcasting. So I started to direct my career in that way. But brother, not in my wildest dream did I think that the UFC was going to, come calling and buy out my contract from ESPN in 2011. And the real launching point for me was March of 2011, when the UFC had essentially made a determination that they were going to be doubling their live event schedule from 20 to 40 live events, and they needed a second play-by-play guy, and that job was offered to me. So had they not sort of been bullish about their expansion plans, who knows? But I was so happy to have a job that was wholly rooted in play-by-play that it didn't matter if they were on the G4 network, Fox Sports, or anybody else. I was joining.
Do you think you would be as excited if it was, G4 Network or UFC pay-per-view in front of 2 million people?
So back then, I believed so strongly in mixed martial arts and the UFC as a brand that I didn't really much care what network it was going to be on. Now, certainly a lot of us could have foreseen a time a couple decades down the line, as we stand right now, that ESPN would be in the mixed martial arts game, or that Fox domestically in America would be willing to sign a television deal, a rights deal with the UFC. But it's still blood sport to some people. And even though our sport is superficially violent, a lot of people can't get past the blood, even though our sport maybe isn't as violent as rugby or football or ice hockey or boxing. Certainly there's a lot of people that can't get past it. So we've made tremendous strides when it comes to our television imprint around the world and here in the United States. But for me, it was more about aligning with the UFC. And yeah, you could argue if I stayed at ESPN, I'd be doing football and I'd have a great job. I could also be unemployed. You just don't know how the chips would have fallen. So I think I bet on the right horse.
You think it's ironic how your career's kind of gone full circle from starting at ESPN to now the UFC being back on ESPN?
Yeah, man. I mean, it was pretty bittersweet for me when the UFC left Fox, because I knew that a lot of my colleagues at Fox were no longer going to be working in mixed martial arts, a sport that they had come to love. And also that a lot of those people at Fox potentially were going to be unemployed. But I was fighting for mixed martial arts at ESPN in 2007, 2008, 2009, before I left in 2011. And it just felt like it was such an uphill battle, that we were the redheaded stepchild, that nobody really cared about mixed martial arts. And we're still fighting some of those battles internally, believe it or not, even though we have a television deal with ESPN. But yeah, for me, as a guy who spent 6 years in Bristol, Connecticut, cutting my teeth in radio and television, to then leave ESPN and then find my way back in via the UFC. Yeah, I mean, full circle is probably the best way to describe it.
Being from the UK, maybe I'm a bit biased with this. One of my favorite lines from you is the Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman second fight, when you said this is not the cloth Leon's cut from. Was that just a spare in the moment thought?
Yeah, I mean, that, I guess, for me is probably the most special singular moment of my broadcasting career at this point in time. We added that Leon Edwards headshot bang to our Anik and Florian podcast open, and that'll withstand the test of time. But basically, Dean Thomas, our tremendous coach on the broadcast, had trotted out the moral victory line pretty early on. Like, Leon just looks listless, and a lot of us just didn't understand why Leon wasn't more urgent in that fight. And I think there were a lot of different reasons. Maybe his cardio abandoned him. Maybe the altitude played a role. Maybe he felt a little bit flat. But the moral victory thing got trotted out again, in that fifth round. And at that point in time, it was total spur of the moment in terms of what I said. But when I heard it again, my inner monologue was like, yeah, but he's just not that guy. Leon Edwards does not care about a moral victory. He's not going to wake up on Sunday morning being like, hey, at least I didn't get finished by Kamaru Usman. He don't care. So I was like, yeah, but this dude is just not the moral victory guy. That is just not the cloth from which he is cut. And then Leon, with the timing, landed the head kick shortly thereafter.
And I
it's
think
a special moment. It's a special moment for me for more reasons than one, right? Because like I hadn't called a fight in the UK in 10 years. And if Leon doesn't land that head kick, I'm still sitting here talking to you saying the last fight I called in the UK was 2013, right? So it opened up that world again for us to do a pay-per-view in England. You guys deserve the big shows, right? For watching these live events at all hours of the night for every weekend of your lives, or at least 41 times a year. So it was a hugely special moment. I feel forever linked to Leon and forever bonded to him. And, I'm just really proud of him and everything that he's accomplished. And, hopefully he appreciates, the soundtrack to the greatest knockout of his career.
With the UFC schedule, you get to travel all over the world, whether that's North America, South America, Australia, or even here to the UK. Where's your favorite place to visit?
Well, it's interesting because I've gotten to go to Brazil about 27 times. I haven't gotten to go to the United Kingdom really at all over the last 10 years. So that is obviously pretty special for me. I feel a kinship to the fans in the UK because the show that I started on, MMA Live, was on ESPN UK before it was ever on television in the United States. So I've always felt a connection to people over there. And, I think you always want what you can't have. I've been to Australia and Brazil a million times, but I don't get to call fights in the UK all that often. So London was particularly special. And not that I'm a history buff, but that was the first time I actually got to like go around London and experience the city. So that was pretty special. But yeah, I mean, Australia is nice because the food is outstanding and the people speak the language. Brazil will always hold a special place in my heart because of all the special UFC moments that we've experienced over there. But yeah, I would have to say Australia is probably the most beautiful place that we go to consistently.
Would you be heading back to Australia for UFC 291, which looked like being headlined by Israel Adesanya?
I will be there.
With your background, Anik and Florian podcast, you started in 2015. How did that come about?
So I knew that once we started the podcast, we were going to have to be weekly, and you have to be consistent when you start a show. I'm sure you can relate to that a little bit. So I had to get Kenny Florian on board to make sure that he was going to commit to do this every Monday for at least a couple years and do it for $0 for a while. We didn't make any money on the podcast for, I think, the first 4 years. And it is twofold. It's the best way for me to give back to fans, right? Free content. And I believe most of, the fans appreciate the fact that that it's sort of evolved from audio to video, and we put an increased emphasis on the video side. And then the second fold is that it gives me a platform and an outlet to get things off my chest, to provide clarity if maybe there's something on the broadcast or if there's something judging or scoring related. I have a platform to put my opinion out there. Now, certainly I could just launch my own YouTube channel or do it on Instagram and probably make more money doing it that way. But it also gives me a chance to talk to my best friend, Kenny Florian, 1 time a week. So I absolutely love it. I can't even believe, we're coming up on 9 years, and, hopefully we got another 9 in us.
Is it something that you just enjoy as a passion project as well as doing the UFC stuff?
Absolutely. And the outlet, I think, is really an important part of it, to sort of double down on that, to be able to have a platform after things happen. Because, as a public figure with a high profile forward facing job, sometimes I need a microphone to address things that happen. So that's a big part of it. But yeah, it's a labor of love, man. I mean, we're certainly not paying the mortgage with what we make on the Anik and Florian podcast, right? But I also feel like when I go to live events, as humbly as I can say this, people come up to me and they ask me about the podcast, or they say, hey, I listen to the podcast. They're not saying, hey, I love you on the live events necessarily, right? So that makes me feel like it's been the primary conduit through which I've connected with most of the fans. So I think the onus is on us to continue doing it, to make sure that the content is of a high level, to make sure that it's consistent, and to make sure that it's free.
Well, whether it's your podcast, Joe Rogan's, or like Michael Bisping's, it's always nice as an MMA fan to be able to get a perspective from these, high value members of our sport.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's a lot of competition in the space. I mean, even in 2015, some people said to me, you guys are launching a podcast now, you're 5 years too late. Well, there are a lot of people who launched podcasts in 2022 and 2023, and I wouldn't suggest to you that those people are too late. It's about the content. It's about the consistency. It's about the craft. And when you focus on those things, generally speaking, good things come on the other side.
When you watch UFC events, when you're not commentating, do you find yourself, you're learning and maybe taking some of the things that Brendan Fitzgerald, John Gooden does and try implementing into your own game?
Not necessarily at this stage of my career. I think I'm more listening to the analysts because I learn a lot from their analytics and how they all interpret mixed martial arts. But yeah, I mean, I want to be challenged by all the play-by-play guys, and I feel that challenge from my other colleagues, you know. But yeah, I mean, I feel like really what I tell a lot of people, what I used to tell my broadcasting students is you got to listen to yourself. And yes, like when I turn on a fight and I'm watching film, I'm excited when it's not me, because I think for a lot of us, we don't want to hear ourselves all the time. So when I put on a fight on UFC Fight Pass and it's Fitzy or it's good, and I'm glad that it's them, right? Because I get sick of hearing myself. But if you really want to improve your craft, the best way to do it is to listen to yourself, to listen to your own podcast, right? Like you probably won't watch this show back, right? Like Kenny Florian, I always give him grief about this. He's probably listened back to like 1 or 2 of the 420 shows that we've done. And I'll be like, dude, how are you going to get any better? Now, I don't listen to our show as much as I did when we started, but how are you going to get better? How are you going to know if you have verbal crutches, right? I didn't realize, Jay, I was using like swears as verbal crutches. I thought my primary verbal crutches were and you know and candidly, and my biggest verbal crutch was fuck. And so I've actually tried to swear less, not because our audience is young and some kids listen, that's part of it, but because I was realizing I was using it as a verbal crutch.
Well, one of the play-by-plays that Brendan Fitzgerald came on my podcast, and he told me that he talked to you before his Dana White Tuesday Night Contender series, and you gave him a call to help him how the business works. When you look back on your career and you seeing that you're helping the new guys like Brendan Fitzgerald, is that something that pleases you?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you look pretty young to me, right? But I'm sitting here talking to you today, right? Because I want to help you. Now, certainly you could argue it helps my brand to be on your show, but I'm here talking to you today and giving you 20, 25 minutes of my time because I want to help you and your show, because you've gone about things the right way and you've built whatever measure of following because your content is good and you appreciate your guests and you appreciate the sport. So yeah, I would help anybody who reached out. My time isn't as vast as it used to be. I used to do almost every interview like this, Jay. Now I'm selective about which ones I actually do. But no, it's very much powerful to have the opportunity to give back. I think my biggest labor of love of anything I ever did was teaching autistic kids, and a close second was teaching at the Connecticut School of Broadcasting, you know. So I do feel like more than being a broadcaster, I was put on this earth to teach and to help people. But sometimes, you know, life and money gets in the way. But I'm telling you, if I could make the money teaching special needs kids that I make doing this, I would be long gone, but I can't.
I'm sure you would. As well as MMA, I know you're a big Boston Celtics fan. What was your thoughts on them this season, losing to the Eastern Conference Final to Miami Heat?
Oh, it was tough, man. I mean, that Game 7 loss, even though they had dug themselves a 3-0 hole, and I probably should have been happy that they had fought their way back into the series, that Game 7 loss, one of the worst losses for me as a professional sports fan. And I live here in South Florida, so it was hard to sort of escape all of the Miami Heat noise there for a couple of weeks. But I love the organization. Wick Grossbeck is a tremendous owner. Brad Stevens has done a tremendous job in the front office. Joe Mazzulla, the head coach, is a big MMA fan, which I did not know. He trains in jiu-jitsu, which is pretty damn cool. And I love what they've done this offseason and getting one of the most skilled big men of all time in Kristaps Porzingis. So I'm optimistic. Marcus Smart was one of my favorite Celtics of all time. I'm a little bit upset that he is no longer with us, but I'm optimistic. And the Celtics were favored to win the NBA championship last year, and they'll be one of the favorites to win it this year. So I think they got a good chance to be in the Final Four again, and we'll see if they can finally get over that proverbial hump.
You look at the Boston team, you don't think there's much stopping them with Jason Tatum winning All-Star MVP last season. You got Jaylen Brown. How do you see them?
Yeah, they're loaded. They're loaded. It's just about staying healthy and peaking at the right time. And Obviously, last year, they were inconsistent in the playoffs. Even though they were the best team, you didn't know what you were going to get. They didn't really hold down their home court. But their foundation, their core, adding Kristaps Porzingis to Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, you know, you never like to be the front runner. You never like to be the favorite. But the Boston Celtics should be in the Final Four. They got a great chance to win the title.
You see that Game 7 against Philadelphia 76 Jason Tatum just started popping off and scoring points for fun.
He's unbelievable. And it's interesting because I named my second child, my daughter Tatum, in 2013, well before Jason Tatum came to Boston. So it was pretty cool that, you know, now there are two legends out of Massachusetts, my daughter and also Jason Tatum.
One last thing I want to ask you about Jon Anik is the 209 tattoo. Have you still got it?
Of course, man.
Is
Right
that
there,
story?
of course.
Is that story? Do you think you'll be telling your grandkids in 30, 40 years' time?
Yeah, I actually finally sat my daughters down about a year ago and I showed them the video of Nate Diaz saying, you know, if Jon Anik doesn't get the 209 tattoo, I'm going to whoop his little ass. And my eldest daughter looked at me and she was like, well, you got it, right? I was like, yeah, I got it. But, you know, it's all good. Daddy wasn't going to get in any fights. But yeah, we've had fun with it. We've done 5 or 6 tattoo bets. You know, right now we still have one that's active with Dracus du Plessis. If he beats Robert Whittaker and Israel Adesanya in a span of 9 weeks, I have to get the South Africa flag tattooed on my body, right? So first thing he had to do was beat Whittaker. He did that. Second thing he has to do is accept the Adesanya fight on September 9th and then actually go there and beat him. But we have fun with it on the podcast. And I have Nate Diaz immortalized behind me in my podcast studio. And there's no fighters I'd rather represent than the Diaz brothers. So yeah, 209 for life, 209. Let's go.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it. I know you're a busy man and you got better things to do in your time than talk to me on Zoom.
My man, I appreciate your time as well. Good luck with everything. We'll talk again.
Thank you so much, John.